The great obscurity and uncertainty in which the history of Orpheus is involved affords very little matter for our information, and even renders that little inaccurate and precarious. Upon surveying the annals of past ages, it seems that the greatest geniuses have been subjected to this historical darkness, as is evident in those great lights of antiquity, Homer and Euclid, whose writings indeed enrich mankind with perpetual stores of knowledge and delight, but whose lives are for the most part concealed in impenetrable oblivion. But this historical uncertainty is nowhere so apparent as in the person of Orpheus, whose name is indeed acknowledged and celebrated by all antiquity, except perhaps Aristotle alone, while scarcely a vestige of his life is to be found amongst the immense ruins of time. For who has ever been able to affirm anything with certainty concerning his origin, his age, his parents, his country, and condition? This alone may be depended on, from general assent, that there formerly lived a person named Orpheus, whose father was Oeagrus, who lived in Thrace, and who was the son of a king, and who was the founder of theology among the Greeks, the institutor of their life and morals, the first of prophets, and the prince of poets, himself the offspring of a muse, who taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries, and from whose wisdom, as from a perpetual and abundant fountain, the divine muse of Homer and the philosophy of Pythagoras and Plato flowed. And lastly, who, by the melody of his lyre, drew rocks, woods, and wild beasts, stopped rivers in their courses, and ever moved the inexorable king of hell, as every page and all the writings of antiquity sufficiently evince. Since thus much then may be collected from universal testimony, let us pursue the matter a little farther, by investigating more accurately the history of the original Orpheus, with that of the great men who have, at different periods, flourished under this venerable name. The first and genuine Orpheus was a poet of Thrace, and according to the opinion of many, the disciple of Linus, who flourished, says the Suda, at the time when the kingdom of the Athenians was dissolved. Some assert that he was prior to the Trojan Wars, and that he lived 11, or, according to others, 9 generations. But the Greek word genea, or generation, according to Giraldus, signifies the space of 7 years. For unless this is supposed, how is it possible that the period of his life can have any foundation in the nature of things? Plutarch, indeed Heraclitus, Suda, and some grammarians, assert that this word signifies a space of 30 years, but omitting the discussion of this latter opinion, from its impossibility, we shall embrace the former, agreeable to which Orpheus lived 63 years, a period, if we may believe the astrologers, fatal to all, and especially to great men, as was the case with Cicero and Aristotle. Our poet, according to fabulous tradition, was torn to pieces by Ciconian women, on which account Plutarch affirms the Thracians were accustomed to beat their wives that they might revenge the death of Orpheus. Hence, in the vision of Harris Pamphilius, in Plato, the soul of Orpheus, being destined to descend into another body, is reported to have chosen rather that of a swan than to be born again of a woman, having conceived such hatred against the sex on account of his violent death. The cause of his destruction is variously related by authors. Some report that it arose from his being engaged in puerile loves after the death of Eurydice. Others that he was destroyed by women intoxicated with wine because he was the means of relinquishing their connection. Others affirm, according to the tradition of Pausanias, that upon the death of Eurydice, wandering to Aornus, a place in Thesprotia, when it was customary to evoke the souls of the dead, having recalled Eurydice to life, and not being able to detain her, he destroyed himself. Nightingales building their nests and bringing forth their young upon his tomb, whose melody, according to report, exceeded every other of this species. Others again ascribe his laceration to his having celebrated every divinity except Bacchus, which is very improbable, as among the following hymns there are 9 to that deity, under different appellations. Others report that he was delivered by Venus herself into the hands of the Ciconian women, because his mother Calliope had not determined justly between Venus and Proserpine concerning the young Adonis. Many affirm he was struck by lightning, according to Pausanias, and Diogenes confirms this by the following verses composed, as he asserts, by the Muses upon his death. Here by the Muses placed with golden lyre, great Orpheus rests, destroyed by heavenly fire. Again, the sacred mysteries called Thracian derived their appellation from our Thracian bard, because he first introduced sacred rites and religion into Greece, and hence the authors of initiation in these mysteries were called Orpheotelestai. Besides, according to Lucian, our Orpheus brought astrology and the magical arts into Greece, and with respect to his drawing trees and wild beasts by the melody of his lyre, Polyphatus accounts for it as follows. The mad bacchanalian nymphs, says he, having violently taken away cattle and other necessaries of life, retired for some days into the mountains, when the citizens, having expected their return for a long time, and fearing the worst for their wives and daughters, called Orpheus, and entreated him to invent some method of drawing them from the mountains. But he, tuning his lyre agreeable to the orgies of Bacchus, drew the mad nymphs from their retreats, who descended from the mountains bearing at first ferulae and branches of every kind of trees. But to the men who were eye-witnesses of these wonders, they appeared at first to bring down the very woods, and from hence gave rise to the fable. But so great was the reputation of Orpheus that he was deified by the Greeks, and Philostratus relates that his head gave oracles in Lesbos, which, when separated from his body by the Thracian women, was, together with his lyre, carried down the river Hebrus into the sea. In this manner, says Lucian, singing as it were his funeral oration, to which the chords of his lyre impelled by the winds gave a responsive harmony, it was brought to Lesbos and buried. But his lyre was suspended in the temple of Apollo, where it remained for a considerable span of time. Afterwards, when Neanthus, the son of Pittacus the tyrant, found that the lyre drew trees and wild beasts with its harmony, he earnestly desired its possession, and having corrupted the priest privately with money, he took the Orphean lyre and fixed another similar to it in the temple. But Neanthus, considering that he was not safe in the city in the daytime, departed from it by night, having concealed the lyre in his bosom, on which he began to play. But as he was a rude and unlearned youth, he confounded the chords, yet, pleasing himself with the sound, and fancying he produced a divine harmony, he considered himself as the blessed successor of Orpheus. However, in the midst of his transports, the neighboring dogs, roused by the sound, fell upon the unhappy harper and tore him to pieces. The former part of this fable is thus excellently explained by Proclus in his commentaries, or rather fragments of commentaries on Plato's Republic, a work I would earnestly recommend to the liberal for the great light it affords to the recondite theology of the Greeks. Orpheus, says he, on account of his perfect erudition, is reported to have been destroyed in various ways, because, in my opinion, men of that age participated partially of the Orphic harmony, for they could not receive a universal and perfect science. But the principal part of his melody was received by the Lesbians, and on this account, perhaps, the head of Orpheus, when separated from his body, is said to have been carried to Lesbos. Fables of this kind, therefore, are related of Orpheus, no otherwise than of Bacchus, of whose mysteries he was the priest. Thus far, Proclus, and thus much concerning the first or Thracian Orpheus. The second Orpheus was an Arcadian, or according to others, a Ciconian from Bisaltia of Thrace, and is reported to be more ancient than Homer and the Trojan War. He composed figments of fables called mythopoeia and epigrams, and is, according to Giraldus, the author of the following hymns, though I rather choose to refer them, with the fathers Vossius and Eschenbach, to Oneirocritus, or the fourth Orpheus of Critonia. The third Orpheus was of Odrysius, a city of Thrace, near the river Hebrus, but Dionysius in the Suda denies his existence. The fourth Orpheus was of Critonia, who flourished in the time of Pisistratus, about the 50th Olympiad, and is doubtless the same Oneirocritus, the author of these hymns. He wrote Decanalia, Decateria, and, in the opinion of Giraldus, the Argonautics, which are now extant under the name of Orpheus, with other writings called Orphical, but which, according to Cicero, some ascribe to Cecrops the Pythagorean. The last Orpheus was Camarinaeus, a most excellent versifier, and the same, according to Giraldus, whose descent into hell is so universally known. And thus much for the life of Orpheus. Part 2. The Theology of Orpheus. Let us now proceed to his theology, exchanging the obscurity of conjecture for the light of clear evidence, and the intricate labyrinths of fable for the delightful though solitary paths of truth. And here I must acquaint the reader that I shall everywhere deduce my information from the writings of the latter Platonists, as the only source of genuine knowledge on this sublime and obsolete inquiry. The vulgar systems of mythology are here entirely useless, and he who should attempt to elucidate the theology or hymns of Orpheus by any modern hypothesis would be as ridiculously employed as he who should expect to find the origins of a copious stream by pursuing it to its last and most intricate involutions. In conformity with modern prejudices, the author of the letters on mythology endeavors to prove that the Orphic hymns deify the various parts of nature, not considered as animated by different intelligences, but as various modifications of inert and lifeless matter. This hypothesis is no doubt readily embraced by the present philosophers, a great part of whom deny the existence of anything incorporeal, and the better sort, who acknowledge one supreme immaterial being, exclude the agency of subordinate intelligences in the government of the world. Though this doctrine is perfectly philosophical, and at the same time consistent with revelation. The belief, indeed, of the man who looks no higher than sense must be necessarily terminated by appearances. Such a one introduces a dreadful chasm in the universe, and diffuses the deity throughout the whole world like an extended substance, divided with every particle of matter, and changed into the infinite varieties of sensible forms. But with the ancient philosopher, the deity is an immense and perpetually exuberant fountain, whose streams originally filled and continually replenish the world with life. Hence the universe contains in its ample bosom all general natures, divinities visible and invisible, the illustrious race of daimons, the noble army of exalted souls, and men rendered happy by wisdom and virtue. According to this theology, the power of universal soul does not alone diffuse itself to the sea and become bounded by its circumfluent waters, while the wide expanse of air and ether is destitute of life and soul. But the celestial spaces are filled with souls, supplying life to the stars and directing their revolutions in everlasting order, so that the celestial orbs, in imitation of intellect, which seeks after nothing external, are wisely agitated in perpetual circuit round the central sun. While some beings participate of being alone, others of life, and others are endued with sentient powers, some possess the still higher faculty of reason, and lastly others are all life and intelligence. But let us rise a little higher and contemplate the arguments by which the Platonists established the Orphic doctrine of the existence and agency of subordinate intelligences. Thus then, they reason, of all beings, it is necessary that some should move only, and that others should be entirely moved, and that the beings situated between these two should participate of the extremes, and both move and be moved. Among the first in dignity and order are those natures which move only, the second, those which move themselves, the third, those which move and are moved, and the fourth, those which are moved only. Now the second class of these, or the self-motive natures, since their perfection consists in transition and mutation of life, must depend upon a more ancient cause, which subsists perpetually the same, and whose life is not conversant with the circulations of time, but is constituted in the stable essence of eternity. But it is necessary that the third class, which both move and are moved, should depend on a self-motive nature. For a self-motive being is the cause of motion to those which are moved by another, in the same manner as that which is immovable inserts in all beings the power of moving. And again, that which is moved only must depend on those natures, which are indeed moved by another, but which are themselves endued with a motive power. For it is necessary that the chain of beings should be complete, everywhere connected by proper mediums, and deduced in an orderly and perpetual series, from the principles to the extremes. All bodies, therefore, belong to those natures which are moved only, and are naturally passive, since they are destitute of all inherent energy on account of their sluggish nature, which participates of division, magnitude, and weight. But of incorporeals, some are divisible about bodies, while others are entirely free from such an affection about the lowest order of beings. Hence such things, as are divided about the dead weight of bodies, whether they are material qualities or forms, belong to the orders of natures moving, and at the same time moved. For such as these, because incorporeal, participate of a motive faculty, but because they are also divided about bodies, they are on this account exempt from incorporeal perfections. They are filled with material inactivity, and require the energy of a self-motive nature. Where then shall we find this self-motive essence? For such things as are extended with magnitude, oppressed by material weight, and inseparably reside in bodies, must necessarily either move only or be moved by others. But it is requisite, as we have before observed, that prior to this order, the self-motive essence should subsist. And hence we conclude that there is another certain nature exempt from the passivity and imperfection of bodies, existing not only in the heavens, but in the ever-changing elements, from which the motion of bodies is primarily derived. And this nature is no other than soul, from which animals derive their life and motive power, and which even affords an image of self-motion to the unstable order of bodies. If, then, the self-motive essence is more ancient than that which is moved by another, but soul is primarily self-motive, hence soul must be more ancient than body, and all corporeal motion must be the progeny of soul, and of her inherent energy. It is necessary, therefore, that the heavens, with all their boundless contents, and their various natural motions, for a circular motion is natural to such bodies, should be endued with governing souls, essentially more ancient than their revolving bodies. According to the Platonic philosophers, therefore, These souls, which orderly distinguish the universe and its contained parts from their inherent cause of motion, give life and motion to every inanimate body. But it is necessary that every motive essence should either move all things rationally or irrationally, that is, either according to the uniform and unerring laws of reason, or according to the brutal impulse of an irrational nature. But the constant order observed in the periods of the celestial bodies, the convenience of positions, and the admirable laws by which their revolutions are directed, plainly evince that their motions are governed by a rational nature. If, therefore, an intellectual and rational soul governs the universe, and if everything equally moved is under the directing influence of such a soul, we may not inquire whether it possesses this intellectual, perfect, and beneficent power by participation or essentially. For if essentially, it is necessary that every soul should be intellectual, since every soul is naturally self-motive. But if by participation, there must be another nature more ancient than soul, which operates entirely from energy, and whose essence is intelligence, on account of that uniform conception of universals, which it essentially contains. Because it is also necessary that the soul, essentially rational, should receive intellect by participation, and that intellectual energy should be of two kinds, one primarily subsisting in the divine intellect, but the other subsisting secondarily in its offspring soul, you may add, too, the presence of intellectual illumination in body, which is received in as great perfection as its unstable and obscure nature will admit. For how is it possible that the celestial orbs should be forever circularly moved in one definite order, preserving the same form and the same immutable power, unless they participated of an intellectual nature? For soul is indeed the constant supplier of motion, but the cause of perpetual station, of identity and uniform life, reducing unstable motion to a circular revolution and to a condition eternally the same, must be more ancient than soul. Body indeed, and whatever is the object of sense, belongs to the order of things moved by another. But soul is self-motive, embracing in itself, in a connected manner, all corporeal motions. And prior to this is immovable intellect. And here it is requisite to observe that this immaterial nature must not be conceived as similar to anything inert, destitute of life, and endued with no spirit, but as the principal cause of all motion, and the fountain of all life, as well of that whose streams perpetually return into itself, as of that which subsists in others, and has, on this account only, a secondary and imperfect existence. All things, therefore, depend upon unity through the medium of intellect and soul. And intellect is of an uniform essence, but soul of a mental form, noedes, and the body of the world, vivific, or vital, zotikos. The first cause of all is indeed prior to intellect, but intellect is the first recipient of a divine nature, and soul is divine so far as it requires an intellectual medium. But the body which participates a soul of this kind is divine in as great a degree as the nature of body will admit, for the illustration of intellectual light pervades from the principle of things to the extremes, and is not totally obscured even when it enters the involutions of matter and is profoundly merged in its dark and flowing receptacle. Hence we may with reason conclude that not only the universe, but each of its eternal parts is animated and endued with intellect, and is in its capacity similar to the universe. For of each of these parts is a universe if compared with the multitude it contains, and to which it is allied. There is, therefore, according to the Orphic and Platonic theology, one soul of the universe, which from participating in this general soul, disposed the entire parts of the universe into order, and one intellect which is participated in by souls, and one supreme God who comprehends the world in his infinite nature, and a multitude of other divinities who distribute intellectual essences, together with their dependent souls, and all the parts of the world, and who are the perpetual sources of its order, union, and consent. For it is not reasonable to suppose that every production of nature should have the power of generating its similar, but that the universe and primary essences should not more abundantly possess an ability of such like procreation, since sterility can only belong to the most abject and not to the most excellent natures. In consequence of this reasoning, Orpheus filled all things with gods, subordinate to the demiurgus of the whole demiurgo, every one of which performs the office destined to his divinity by his superior leader. Hence, according to his theology, there are two worlds, the intelligible and the sensible. Hence, too, his three demiurgic principles, the jovial, dionysiacal, and adonical, from whence many orders and differences of gods proceed: intelligible, intellectual, supermundane, mundane, celestial, authors of generation. And among these, some in the order of guardian, demiurgic, elevating, and comprehending gods, perfecters of works, vivific, immutable, absolute, judicial, purgative, etc. And besides these, to each particular divinity he added a particular multitude of angels, daimons, and heroes. For, according to Proclus, relating the opinion of Orpheus and the theologians, about every god there is a kindred multitude of angels, heroes, and daimons, for every god presides over the form of that multitude which receives the divinity. He likewise considered a difference of sex in these deities, calling some male and others female, the reason of which distinction Proclus, with his usual elegance and subtlety, thus explains. The division of male and female comprehends in itself all the plenitudes of divine orders, since the cause of stable power and identity, and the leader, choregos, of being, and that which invests all things with the first principle of conversion, is comprehended in the masculine order. But that which generates from itself all various progressions and partitions, measures of life and prolific powers, is contained in the female division. And on this account, Timaeus also, converting himself to all the gods by this division of generated natures, embraced their universal orders. But a division of this kind is particularly accommodated and proper to the present theory, because the universe is full of this twofold kind of gods. For that we may begin with extremes, heaven corresponds with earth in order and proportion of male to female, since the motions of the heavens imparts particular properties and powers to particular things, but on the other hand, earth receiving the celestial defluxions becomes pregnant and produces plants and animals of every kind. And of the gods existing in the heavens, some are distinguished by the male division, and others by the female, and authors of generation, since they are themselves destitute of birth, are some of this order and others of that, for the demiurgic choir is abundant in the universe. There are also many canals, as it were, for life, some of which exhibit the male, and others the female form. But why should I insist on this particular? Since from the absolute unities, whether endued with a masculine or feminine form, various orders of being flow into the universe. This was all Proclus. But that Orpheus was a monarchist, as well as a polytheist, is not only evident from the preceding arguments, originally derived from his theology, but from the following verses quoted by Proclus. Hence with the universe great Jove contains the ether bright, and heaven's exalted plains, the extended restless sea, and earth renowned, ocean immense, Tartarus profound, fountains and rivers, and the boundless main, with all that nature's ample realms contain, and gods and goddesses of each degree, all that is past, and all that e'er shall be. Occultly and in fair connection lies, in Jove's wide womb, the ruler of the skies. And in the same place, Proclus has preserved to us another copy of Orphic verses, which are also found in the writer, previous to which he observes that the demiurgus, or artificer of the world, being full of ideas, comprehended by these all things within himself, as that theologian, Orpheus, declares. Jove is the first and last thundering king, middle and head, from Jove all beings spring. In Jove the male and female forms combine, for Jove's a man, and yet a maid divine. Jove the strong basis of the earth contains, and the deep splendor of the starry plains. Jove is the breath of all, Jove's wondrous frame lives in the rage of ever restless flame. Jove is the sea's strong root, the solar light, and Jove's the moon, fair regent of the night. Jove is a king by no restraint confined, and all things flow from Jove's prolific mind. One is the power divine in all things known, and one the ruler, absolute, alone. For in Jove's royal body all things lie, fire, night and day, earth, water, and the sky. The first begetters, pleasing love and mind, these in his mighty body Jove confined. See how his beauteous head and aspect bright illumine heaven and scatter boundless light, round which his pendant golden tresses shine, formed from the starry beams with light divine. On either side two radiant horns behold, shaped like a bowl's and brights with glittering gold. And east and west in opposition lie the lucid paths of all the gods on high. His eyes the sun and moon with borrowed ray, royal, ethereal, and his ear refined, hears every voice and sounds of every kind. Thus are his head and mind immortal, bright, his body's boundless, stable, full of light. Strong are his members, with a force endued, powerful to tame, but never to be subdued. The extended region of surrounding air forms his broad shoulders, back and bosom fair. And through the world the ruler of the skies, upborne on natal, rapid pinion flies. His sacred belly, earth with fertile plains, and mountains swelling to the clouds contains. His middle zones the spreading sea profound, whose roaring waves the solid globe surround. The distant realms of Tartarus obscure, within earth's roots his holy feet secure. For these earth's utmost bounds to Jove belong, and form his basis, permanent and strong. Thus all things Jove within his breast concealed, and into beauteous light from thence revealed. These verses contain what Dr. Cudworth calls the grand arcanum of Orphic theology, that God is all things, which is likewise an Egyptian doctrine from whence it was derived through Orpheus into Greece. And this sublime truth Plotinus himself proves with his usual sagacity and depth. But here it is necessary to observe that Orpheus and the Platonists do not conceive the deity to be all things as if he were a divisible corporeal nature, but that he is all things because present everywhere and to every being totally, though more or less intimately present, according to the various gradations and approximations of being, so that he is to be considered as containing all things, and yet as separate and apart from all, as the source of all multitude, yet himself a perfect unity, and as immensely prolific, yet divinely solitary and ineffably good. Thus, according to Porphyry, explaining the properties of incorporeal natures, God, intellect, and soul are each of them everywhere, because nowhere. But God is everywhere, and at the same time in no place of any being posterior to his nature, but he is only such as he is, and such as he willed himself to be. But every intellect is indeed in the deity, yet every and in no place of its subordinate essences. And soul is in intellect, and in the deity, everywhere and nowhere with respect to body, but body exists in intellect and in God. And though all beings and non-entities proceed from and subsist in the deity, yet he is neither entities or non-entities, nor has any subsistence in them. For if he was alone everywhere, he would indeed be all things, and in all. But because he is likewise nowhere, all things are produced by him, so that they subsist in him because he is everywhere, but are different from him because he is nowhere. Thus also intellect, being everywhere and nowhere, is the cause of souls, and of natures subordinate to soul. At the same time, it is neither a soul, nor such things as are posterior to the soul, nor has it any substance in them, and this because it is not only everywhere in its subordinate natures, but at the same time nowhere. Thus, too, soul is neither body nor in body, but is the cause of body, because while it is everywhere diffused throughout the body, it is nowhere. And this procession of the universe extends as far as to that nature which is incapable of being at the same time everywhere and nowhere, but which partially participates of each. And in another place of the same excellent fragment, he tells us that the ancients, explaining the property of an incorporeal nature, as far as this can be effected by discourse, when they affirmed it to be one, at the same time add that it is likewise all things, that it is everywhere and nowhere, and that it is totally present in every whole. He adds that they express its nature entirely by contrary properties, that they may remove it from the fictitious and delusive conceptions of bodies which obscure those properties by which true being is known. We have before observed that the Platonic philosophers agreeable to the doctrine of Orpheus considered fecundity as, in an eminent degree, the property of a divine nature, and from this principle filled the universe with gods. This opinion a modern philosopher, or a modern writer on mythology, will doubtless consider as too ridiculous to need a serious refutation. The one because he believes the phenomena may be solved by mechanical causes, and the other in consequence of a system originating from prejudice and supported without proof. However, prejudice apart, let us hear what the philosophers can urge in defense of this doctrine, in addition to what we have already advanced. To begin, then, with Onotus the Pythagorean, those, says he, who assert that there is but one God, and not many gods, are deceived, as not considering that the supreme dignity of the divine transcendency consists in governing beings similar to itself and in surpassing others. But the other gods have the same relation to this first and intelligible god, as the dancer to the coryphaeus, and as soldiers to their general, whose duty it is to follow their leader. And although the same employment is common to both the ruler and those who are ruled, yet the latter, if destitute of a leader, could no longer conspire together in one occupation, as the concord of the fingers and dancers and the expedition of the army must fail if one is deprived of the coryphaeus and the other of the captain or commander. To the same purpose, Plotinus shows that it is perfectly philosophical to suppose a multitude of gods subordinate to the one supreme. It is necessary, says he, that every man should endeavor to be as good as possible, but at the same time he should not consider himself as the only thing that is good, but should be convinced that there are other good men, and good daimons in the universe, but much more gods, who, though inhabiting this inferior region, yet look up to that higher world, and especially that most blessed soul, the ruling divinity of this universe, from whence a man ought to ascend still higher, and to celebrate the intelligible gods, but above all their great king, declaring his majesty in a particular manner by the multitude of gods subordinate to his divinity. For it is not the province of those who know the power of God to contract all into one, but rather to exhibit all that divinity which he has displayed, who himself, remaining one, produces many which proceed from him and by him. For the universe subsists by him, and perpetually speculates his divinity, together with each of the gods it contains. Should it be objected that if such gods or exalted beings really existed, we should be able to demonstrate the reality of their existence in the same manner as that of one supreme God? We cannot frame a better reply than the words of Proclus. And perhaps, says he, you may affirm that souls more swiftly forget things nearer to them, but have a stronger remembrance of superior principles. For these last operate on them more vigorously, through the sublimity of their power, and appear to be present with them by their energy. And this happens with respect to corporeal flight, which does not perceive many things situated on earth, yet observes the inerratic sphere and the stars it contains, because these strongly irradiate our eyes with their light. So the eye of our soul is more forgetful, and sooner loses the sight of principles proximate to its nature than of such as are more elevated and divine. In like manner, all religions and sects confess that there is one highest principle, and men everywhere invoke God as their helper. But that there are gods in subordination to this first cause, and that there is a providence proceeding from these to the universe, all men do not believe, and this because the one appears to them more perspicuously than the many. Indeed, in consequence of the Platonic doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul, it is not strange that we should know little of those divine and exalted beings above us, since, from our union with generation and material concerns, we are imbued with oblivion, ignorance, and error. We are similar, as Porphyry well observes, to those who enter or depart from a foreign region, not only in casting aside our native manners and customs, but from the long use of a strange country, we are imbued with affections, manners, and laws foreign from our own natural and true religion, and with a strong propensity to these unnatural habits. As, therefore, it is not wonderful that the greatest part of those who inhabit a pestiferous region should languish and decline, but that a very few should preserve their natural strength, so we ought not to wonder that, thus placed in generation, the multitude of mankind are obnoxious to passions and depraved habits, but we ought rather to be astonished if any souls thus involved in the dark folds of the body, and surrounded with such great and unceasing mutations, are found sober, pure, and free from destructive perturbations. For it is surely astonishing that the soul should live immaterially in material concerns, and preserve itself uncontaminated amidst such base defilements, that it should drink the cup of oblivion, and not be laid asleep by the intoxicating draught, that it should elevate its eyes above the sordid darkness with which it is surrounded, and be able to open up the gates of truth, which, though contained in its essence, are guarded and shut by terrene and material species. But that it is possible to know more of such exalted natures than is generally believed by the assistance of ancient philosophy, accompanied with a suitable life, is, I am persuaded, true, and I would recommend the arduous and glorious investigation to every liberal mind. Let us now consider the nature of sacrificing according to Orpheus and the Platonists, previous to which I must beg leave to inform the reader that the Greek theologians and philosophers were not, as they are represented by modern writers on mythology, so stupid as to worship the creature instead of the creator, and to neglect or confound that homage and veneration which is due to the first cause of all. On the contrary, they considered the Supreme Being as honored by the reverence paid to his most illustrious offspring, and carefully distinguished between the worship proper to the deity and the subordinate gods, as the following discourse will abundantly evince. How far, indeed, such opinions may be consistent with revelation is not my business to determine. It is sufficient for me to give the most faithful account I am able of their sentiments on this subject, to free their opinions from misrepresentation, and to show that God has not left himself without a witness among the wise and learned of the heathens. But as I cannot give a better account of the nature and antiquity of sacrifice than from the writings of Porphyry, I shall present the reader with the following paraphrase on part of the second book of his excellent work on abstinence. The period of time appears to have been immensely distant from which, as Theophrastus says, a nation the most learned of all others, and inhabiting the sacred region formed by the Nile, began first of all, from the domestic fire, to sacrifice to the celestial divinities, not with myrrh or cassia, nor with the first fruits of frankincense mingled with saffron, for these were applied many ages afterwards, from error increasing in certain degrees, I mean at the period when men, having surmounted the difficulties of a life formerly oppressed with the cares of procuring necessaries, and from the beginning to the end attended with many labors and tears, sacrificed perhaps a few drops to the gods. For at first they performed sacrifices not with aromatics, but with the first fruits of the green herb, plucking it with their hands, as a certain soft down or moss of prolific nature. Indeed, the earth produced trees before animals, but prior to trees, the annually rising grass, the leaves and roots, and entire produce of which having been collected, they sacrificed with fire. By this sacrifice, saluting the visible celestial gods, and rendering them through the ministry of fire immortal honors. For we preserve as sacred to those divinities a perpetual fire in our temples, since this element is most similar to their lucid frames. But with respect to fumigations from herbs produced by the earth, they called the censer or pan in which the herbs were burnt thumiaterios, and to perform sacrifice thuein, and the sacrifices themselves thusiai, all which we have erroneously interpreted as if these words were signatures of that error which afterwards crept in among us, and hence it is that we call the worship consisting from the slaughter of animals thusiai. Indeed, so great was the care of the ancients in retaining their primeval customs that they uttered imprecations against those who deserted the old manner and introduced a new one, and therefore called those herbs which we now fumigate aromata, aromatics. But the antiquity of the above-mentioned fumigations will be perceived by him who considers that even now many odorous kinds of wood cut into fragments are employed in sacrifice, from whence it happened that the earth, now bearing trees together with grass, its earliest productions, men at first eating the fruits of oaks, burned only a few of these in sacrifice to the gods, on account of the rarity of such sustenance, but sacrificed a multitude of the leaves. Afterwards, human life passed to a gentle diet, and sacrifices were performed with nuts, from whence the proverb originated, olis druos, enough of the oak. But among the fruits of Ceres, after the first appearance of leguminous barley, mankind were accustomed to sprinkle it, made into an entire mass, in their first sacrifices. Afterwards, breaking the barley, and diminishing the nutriment into a meal, having concealed the instruments of so great a work, which afford divine assistance to human life, they approached these as certain sacred concerns. But they cast the first fruits of the barley, when bruised into a meal, and which was more esteemed than when whole, into the fire, in sacrifice to the gods, from whence even now, at the conclusion of the sacrifice, we make use of meal mixed with wine and oil. By this custom, indeed, we indicate from whence and from what beginnings sacrifices have increased to the present state, but at the same time we do not consider why such things are performed. Mankind, proceeding from all these small beginnings, and the earth yielding an abundant supply of corn and various fruits, they judged that the first produce of all the rest should be offered in the sacrifices, with a view of pleasing the various orders of the gods, selecting many things for this purpose, and mingling not a few others with these, if they possessed anything beautiful, and on account of its odoriferous nature accommodated to divine sensation. With some of these formed into garlands, they encircled the statues of the gods, and others they sacrificed with fire. Likewise to the gods, as the proper causes, they poured forth the divine drops of wine and honey and oil, when their uses were first discovered. The truth of the preceding account appears to be confirmed by the procession celebrated even now at Athens in honor of the sun and the hours. For in this solemnity, grass is carried about, and wrapping the kernels of the olives, attended with figs, all kinds of pulse, oaken boughs and acorns, the fruit of the strawberry, wheat and barley, a mass of dried figs, cakes composed from the meal of wheat and barley, heaped into a pyramidal form, and last of all, olives. Theophrastus, then, proceeds to show the impropriety of animal sacrifices, after which he adds, "But the utility of fruits is the first and greatest of every production, the first fruits of which are to be sacrificed to the gods alone, and to the earth, the prolific parent of every herb. For earth is the common vesta of the gods and men, on whose fertile surface reclining, as on the soft bosom of a mother or a nurse, we ought to celebrate her divinity with hymns and incline to her with filial affection as to the source of our existence. For thus, when we approach to the conclusion of our mortal life, we shall be thought worthy of a reception into the celestial regions, and of an association with the race of immortal gods, who now behold us venerating their divinities with those fruits, of which they are the authors, and sacrificing in their honor every herb of the all-bearing earth, at the same time not esteeming every thing worthy or proper to be offered as a testimony of our homage. For as everything indiscriminately is not to be sacrificed to the gods, so perhaps we cannot find anything sufficiently worthy with which we may worship them as they deserve." Thus far, Theophrastus. Porphyry then proceeds to show after what manner those ought to sacrifice who propose an intellectual life as the ultimate object of their pursuit. Let us also, says he, sacrifice but in a manner becoming of the offspring of intellect, bringing with us the most exalted offerings, with our most exalted powers. To the divinity, indeed, who is above all things, as a wise man said, neither sacrificing nor dedicating anything sensible or material, for there is nothing subsisting by material concretion which must not be deemed impure by a nature entirely free from the contagion of body. Hence even the discourse which is proffered by the voice is not proper to be addressed to a cause so sublime and ineffable, nor the internal speech of the soul, if contaminated with any perturbation, or mixed with any of the sensible phantasms of imagination. But we ought to worship the supreme God in the most profound and pure silence, and with the purest thoughts concerning his exalted nature. It is requisite, therefore, that having conjoined and assimilated ourselves to him, we should approach this sublime principle with a pious sacrifice, which we may redound to his praise and to our safety. But such a sacrifice can only be performed by contemplating his divinity with a soul free from material affections and with the rational eye filled with intellectual light. But to the offspring of this first God, I mean the intelligible divinities, we should present the sacrifice of hymns composed by the rational principle. For it is customary to offer the first fruits of such things as every god bestows upon us, by which he nourishes and supports our existence, and which are subservient to the purposes of sacrifice. As the husbandman, therefore, performs sacred rites by presenting handfuls of pulse and fruits, so ought we to sacrifice our purest thoughts and other goods of the soul, thanking the divinities for the sublime contemplations they afford us, and for truly feeding our intellectual part with the speculation of their essences, for conversing with us, and appearing to our mental sight, for shining upon us with divine splendors, and by this means procuring for us true salvation. But an exercise of this kind is performed in an indolent manner, by many who apply themselves to philosophy, and who more sedulously cultivating fame than honoring the divinity, are wholly employed about statues, taking no care to learn after what manner, or whether or not these intellectual beings are to be adorned, nor properly consulting divine concerns, are they anxious to know in how great a degree we ought to strive after a union with these exalted natures. With such as these we by no means contend, since our only endeavor is to obtain a knowledge of divinity, and to imitate pious and ancient men by frequently sacrificing of that contemplation which the gods have bestowed upon us, and by the use of which we are partakers of real salvation. The Pythagoreans, indeed, who were very studious of numbers and lines, for the most part sacrificed of these to the gods, denominating this number to Minerva, another to Apollo, and again this justice, another temperance. They proceeded also in a similar manner in geometrical figures. Hence they pleased the divinities by sacrifices of this kind, calling each of them by their proper names, for the purposes of obtaining their particular requests. They often besides made such invocations subservient to the purposes of divination, and if they required the investigation of anything particular, they used the visible celestial gods, also the wandering and fixed stars, of which the sun ought to be placed as the leader, next to this the moon, and as the theologian observes, we should make fire allied to these by approximate conjunction. But the same person asserts that the Pythagoreans sacrificed no animal, but offered the first fruits of flour and honey, and of the first diversified productions of the earth, nor kindled fire on the bloody altar, says he, with other things of a similar nature. But why should I transcribe such relations? For he who is truly studious of piety knows why he ought not to sacrifice anything animated to the gods, but alone to the genii and other powers superior to man, whether good or bad. He likewise knows to what kind of men it belongs to sacrifice these, and every circumstance respecting those beings, who require such sacrifices to be performed. With regard to other particulars, I shall be silent. But what some Platonists have divulged will perspicuously illustrate the subject before us, which I relate as follows. The first god, since he is incorporeal, immovable, and indivisible, neither existing in any being, place, or time, nor even circumscribed by, and as it were invested with himself, is in no respect indigent of anything external to his nature, as we have already observed. But his last property of a divine essence is likewise true of the soul of the world, possessing a triple divisibility, and being naturally self-motive, yet so constituted that it chooses to move in an orderly and beautiful manner, and to agitate the corporeal fabric of the world according to the most excellent and harmonious reasons. But it associates to itself, and is circularly invested with body, although incorporeal and entirely destitute of passion. But to the other gods, to the world, and to the erratic and fixed stars, composed from body and soul, and to the visible divinities, testimonials of gratitude are to be offered by sacrificing with inanimate substances. After these, there remains that multitude of invisible beings which Plato indiscriminately calls daimons. Some of these are allotted a peculiar name by mankind, from whom they obtain divine honors and other kinds of religious worship, but others of these are for the most part called by no peculiar name, but obscurely worshipped by some men, and are denominated according to certain streets or cities. But the remaining multitude are called by the common name of daimones. Concerning all these, a general persuasion obtains that their influence is noxious and malignant if they are once angered because their accustomed worship is neglected, and that they are again beneficent if appeased by prayers and supplications, by sacrifices and convenient rites. But the confused opinion which subsists concerning these beings, and which has proceeded to great infamy, requires that we should distinguish their natures according to the decisions of reason. After this manner, when they are distributed, as many souls as proceeding from the universal soul, administer considerable parts of those places contained under the lunar orb, who are indeed connected with an aerial part, but subject it to the dominion of reason, are to be esteemed good daimones. We ought to believe that all their operations tend to the utility of the concerns subject to their dominion, whether they preside over certain animals or fruits assigned to their charge, or over things subservient to these particulars, such as prolific showers, moderate winds, serene weather, and whatever is calculated to promote these, as a good temperament of the seasons of the year, etc. They likewise administer to us the use of music, and of every discipline, together with the medicinal and gymnastic arts, and whatever else is allied to these. For it is impossible that such daimones can supply what is convenient and proper, and at the same time be authors of things destructive and improper. In this class, the messengers, as Plato calls them, between the gods and men must be numbered, who convey our prayers and pious offerings to the gods as judges of our conduct, and bring back to us in return divine warnings, exhortations, and oracles. But as many souls as do not properly govern the aerial part with which they are connected, but are for the most part subdued by its influence, and are agitated and hurried away by its brutal power in a rash and disorderly manner, whenever the wrathful irritations and desires of the pneumatic part grow strong, Souls of this kind are properly denominated daimones, but ought at the same time to be called malevolent and base. All these, together with those who obtain a contrary power, are invisible and entirely imperceptible to human sensation, for they are not invested like terrene animals with a solid body, nor are they endued with one shape, but they possess a diversity of forms. However, the forms impressed on their aerial part are sometimes apparent, and at other times obscured. Sometimes, too, evil demons change their shapes, but this pneumatic part, so far as corporeal, is subject to passion and change, and although it is so confined by the coercive power of these demoniacal souls that its form continues for a long time, yet it is not by this means eternal. For it is reasonable to believe that something continually flows from this aerial part, and that it receives a nutriment accommodated to its nature. Indeed, the pneuma, or aerial part of the good daimones, consists in a certain commensurate proportion in the same manner as those bodies which are the objects of our present perception. But the bodies of the malevolent daimones are of a discordant temperament, on which account they inhabit that aerial space proximate to the earth with a passive affection, and for the most part govern things subject to their dominion with a turbulent malignity. Hence there is no evil which they do not endeavor to perpetrate, for their manners are entirely violent and fraudulent, and destitute of the guardian preservation of better daimones, so that they machinate vehement, and sudden snares with which they rush on the unwary, sometimes endeavoring to conceal their incursions, and sometimes acting with open violence against the subjects of their oppression. Thus far, Porphyry, the length of which quotation needs no apology, both on account of its excellence, and because the unlearned reader will not find it elsewhere in English. Let us hear his sentiments concerning the nature of prayer, as they are preserved to us by Proclus in his excellent commentary on the Timaeus, page 64. It is requisite, says Proclus, before all things, that we understand something perspicuously concerning the nature of prayer. I mean in what its essence consists, what its perfection is, and from whence it becomes natural to our souls. He then proceeds to relate the opinion of Porphyry as follows. For Porphyry, discoursing concerning such of the ancients as either approved of or exploded prayer, leads us through various opinions, which I shall now summarily relate. Neither those who labor under the first kind of impiety, I mean denying the existence of the gods, claim any advantage to themselves from prayer, nor yet those of the second class, who entirely subvert a providence, for though they acknowledge the existence of the gods, yet they deny their provident concern for the affairs of the universe. Nor again those of a third order, who they confess that there are gods, and that their providence extends to the world, yet consider all things as produced by divinities from necessity, for the utility of prayer is derived from such things as are contingent and may have a different existence. But those who both acknowledge the being of the gods, and their continual providence, and that some events are contingent and may subsist in a different manner, these men indeed may be truly said to approve of prayer, and to confess that the gods correct our life and establish it in safety. Proclus then proceeds to relate the reasons by which Porphyry confirms its utility. He adds that prayer in a particular manner pertains to worthy men, because it conjoins them with divinity. For similars love to be united together, but a worthy man is in an eminent degree similar to the divine natures. We may likewise add that since good men are placed in custody, and confined by the dark bands of the body, as in a prison, they ought to pray to the gods that it may be lawful for them to depart from hence. Besides, since we are as children torn from the bosom of our parent, we ought on this account to request by our prayers that we may return to the gods, our true intellectual parents. If this is the case, do not they who deny that prayers are to be offered to the gods, and who prevent their souls from being united with the divinities, that is, with beings more excellent than themselves, appear similar to those who are deprived of their parents? Lastly, all nations who have flourished in the exercise of wisdom have applied themselves to divine prayers, as the Brahmins among the Indians, the Magi among the Persians, and amongst the Greeks also those who have excelled in the science of theology. For on this account they instituted mysteries and initiatory rites, teletai. Besides, this consideration is not to be omitted, that since we are part of this universe, it is consonant to reason that we should depend on it for support. For a conversion to the universe procures safety to everything which it contains. If therefore you possess virtue, it is requisite you should invoke that divinity which previously comprehended in himself every virtue. For universal good is the cause of that good which belongs to you by participation. And if you seek after some corporeal good, the world is endued with a power which contains universal body. From hence, therefore, it is necessary that perfection should also extend to the parts. Thus far, that most excellent philosopher Porphyry, in which quotation, as well as the preceding, the reader must doubtless confess that Proclus did not without reason admire him for what he calls his ta hieroprepe noemata, or conceptions adapted to holy concerns. For surely no philosopher ever possessed them in a more eminent degree. If it should be asked in what the power of prayer consists, according to these philosophers, I answer, in a certain sympathy and similitude of natures to each other. Just as in an extended chord, where when the lowest part is moved, the highest presently after gives a responsive motion, or as in the firings of a musical instrument, A tempered to the same harmony, one chord trembling from the pulsation of another, as if it were endued with the sensation from symphony. So, in the universe, there is one harmony, though composed from contraries, since they are at the same time similar and allied to each other. For from the soul of the world, like an immortal self-motive lyre, life everywhere resounds, but in some things more inferior and remote from perfection than in others. And with respect to the supermundane gods, sympathy and similitude subsists in these as in their most perfect exemplars, from whence they are participated by sensible natures, their obscure and imperfect images. Hence, they say, we must not conceive that our prayers cause any animadversion in the gods, or, properly speaking, draw down their beneficence, but that they are rather the means of elevating the soul to these divinities, and disposing it for the reception of their supernal illumination. For the divine irradiation, which takes place in prayer, shines and energizes spontaneously, restoring unity to the soul, and causing our energy to become one with divine energy. For such, according to these philosophers, is the efficacy of prayer, that it unites all inferior with all superior beings. Since, as the great Theodorus says, all things pray except the first. Indeed, so great is the power of similitude that through its unifying natures all things coalesce and impart their particular properties to others. whilst primary nature distributes their gifts to such as are secondary by an abundant illumination, and effects are established in their causes from which they proceed. But the connection and indissoluble society of active universals and of passive particulars is everywhere beheld. For the generative causes of things are contained by similitude in their effects, and in causes themselves their progeny subsist, comprehended in perfect union and consent. Hence the celestial orbs impart a copious deflection of good to this terrestrial region, while sublunary parts, assimilated in a certain respect to the heavens, participate in a perfection convenient to their nature. Hence, too, from the progressions of similitude, there are various leaders in the universe, and many orders of angels dancing harmoniously round their ruling deities, together with a multitude of daimones, heroes, and particular souls. There are, besides, multiform kinds of mortal animals, and various powers of plants, so that all things tend to their respective leaders, and are, as it were, stamped with one sign of domestic unity, which is in some more evident, and in others more obscure. For indeed, similitude in first productions subsists more apparently, but in those of the middle and extreme orders is obscured in consequence of the gradations of progression. Hence, images and exemplars derive their hypostasis from conciliating similitude, and everything through this is familiar to itself and to its kindred natures. But it is time to return from this digression to the business of sacrifice and prayer, that we may therefore have a clearer view of the nature and efficacy of each. Let us hear the elegant and subtle Proclus upon sacrifice and magic, of which the following is a paraphrase. In the same manner as lovers gradually advance from that beauty which is apparent in sensible forms to that which is divine, so the ancient priests, when they considered that there was a certain alliance and sympathy in natural things to each other, and of things manifest to occult powers, and by this means discovered that all things subsist in all, they fabricated a sacred science from this mutual sympathy and similarity. Thus they recognized things supreme, such as are subordinate, and the subordinate in the supreme. In the celestial regions, terrene properties subsisting in causal and celestial manner. In the earth, celestial properties, but according to a terrene condition. For how shall we account for those plants called heliotropes, that is, attendants on the sun, moving in correspondence with the revolutions of its orb, but selenotropes, or attendants on the moon, turning in exact conformity with her motion? Is it because all things pray and compose hymns to the leaders of their respective orders, but some intellectually and others rationally, some in a natural and others after a sensible manner? Hence the sunflower, as far as it is able, moves in a circular dance towards the sun, so that if anyone could hear the pulsations made by its circuit in the air, he would perceive something composed by a sound of this kind, in honor of its king, such as a plant is capable of framing. Hence we may behold the sun and the moon in the earth, but according to a terrene quality. But in the celestial regions, all plants and stones and animals possessing an intellectual life according to a celestial nature. Now, the ancients, having contemplated this mutual sympathy of things, applied for occult purposes both celestial and terrene natures, by means of which, through a certain similitude, they deduced divine virtues into this inferior abode. For indeed, similitude itself is a sufficient cause of binding things together in union and consent. Thus, if a piece of paper is heated and afterward placed near a lamp, though it does not touch the fire, the paper will be suddenly inflamed, and the flame will descend from the superior to the inferior parts. This heated paper we may compare to a certain relation of inferiors to superiors, and its approximation to the lamp, to the opportune use of things according to time, place, and matter. But the procession of fire in the paper aptly represents the presence of divine light to that nature which is capable of its reception. Lastly, the inflammation of the paper may be compared to the deification of mortals, and to the illumination of material natures, which are afterwards carried upwards like the fires of the paper, from a certain participation of divine feed. Again, the lotus before the rising of the sun folds its leaves into itself, but gradually expands them on its rising, unfolding them in proportion to the sun's ascent to the zenith, but as gradually contracting them as that luminary descends to the west. Hence, this plant, by the expansion and contraction of its leaves, appears no less to honor the sun than men by the gestures of their eyelids and the motions of their lips. But this imitation and certain participation of supernal light is not only visible in plants, which possess but a vestige of life, but likewise in particular stones. Thus, the sunstone by its golden rays imitates those of the sun, but the stone called the eye of heaven, or of the sun, has a figure similar to the pupil of an eye, and a ray shines from the middle of the pupil, which has a figure similar to the moon when horned, by a certain change of itself follows the lunar motion. Lastly, the stone called helioselenus, that is, of the sun and the moon, imitates after a manner the congress of those luminaries which it images by its color, so that all things are full of divine natures, terrestrial natures receiving the plenitude of such as are celestial, but celestial of supercelestial essences, while every order of things proceeds gradually in a different descent from the highest to the lowest. For whatever is collected into one above the order of things is afterwards dilated in descending, various souls being distributed under their various ruling divinities. In the end, some things turn round, correspondent to the revolutions of the sun, and others after a manner imitate the solar rays, as the palm and the date. Some the fiery nature of the sun, as the laurel, and others a different property. For indeed, we may perceive the properties which are collected in the sun everywhere distributed to subsequent natures constituted in a solar order, that is, to angels, daimons, souls, animals, plants, and stones. Hence the author of the ancient priesthood discovered from things apparent the worship of superior powers, while they mingled some things and purified with others. They mingled many things indeed together, because they saw that some simple substances possessed a divine property, though not taken singly, sufficient to call down that particular power of which they were participants. Hence, by the mingling of many things together, they attracted upon us a supernal influx, and by the composition of one thing from many, they symbolized with that one which is above many, and composed statues from the mixtures of various substances, conspiring in sympathy and consent. Besides this, they collected composite odors by a divine art into one, comprehending a multitude of powers and symbolizing with the unity of a divine essence. Considering besides that division debilitates each of these, but that mingling them together restores them to the idea of their exemplar, hence the ancient priests, by the mutual relation and sympathy of things to one another, collected their virtues into one, but expelled them by repugnancy and antipathy, purifying when it was requisite with sulphur and bitumen, and the sprinkling of marine water. For sulphur purifies from the sharpness of its odor, but marine water on account of its fiery portion. Besides this, in the worship of the gods, they offered animals and other substances congruous to their nature, and received in the first place the powers of daimones as proximate to natural substances and operations, by whose assistance they evocated these natural bodies to which they approached into their presence. Afterwards, they proceeded from daimones to the powers and energies of the gods, partly indeed from daimoniacal instruction, but partly from their own industry, aptly interpreting symbols and ascending to a proper intelligence of the gods. And lastly, laying aside natural substances and their operations, they received themselves into the communion and fellowship of the gods. Thus far, Proclus, and thus much for the theological doctrine of Orpheus, as contained in the works of the latter Platonists. I persuade myself enough has been said in this dissertation to convince every thinking and liberal mind that the Greek theology as professed and understood by the Greek philosophers is not that absurd and nonsensical system represented by modern prejudice and ignorance as the creed of the ancients. In consequence of a blind and mistaken zeal, it is common to ridicule the opinions of ancient philosophers in order to establish the certainty of the Christian religion. But surely revelation does not require so unwarrantable and feeble a support in which reality only betrays the cause it endeavors to defend, by giving infidels occasion to suspect either weakness in its evidence or obscurity in its fundamental doctrines. Besides, the generality of these uncandid opponents know nothing of the Platonical writers from whom alone genuine information can be derived on this sublime and intricate subject, and from whose works the preceding dissertation has been so abundantly enriched. Were these invaluable books more generally known and understood, if they did not refine our tastes, at present so depraved, they would at least teach us to admire the strength which human reason is capable of exerting, and to be more modest in our pretensions to wisdom. They would silence ignorant declaimers, and stop the immense increase of books on modern philosophy, which are so rapidly hastening to the abyss of forgetfulness, like streams into the ocean from which they originally flowed. The End. On the Life and Theology of Orpheus by Thomas Taylor. Read by Dan Attrell.